He is, tyrant to some, ally to others, a figure who shaped the history of Middle-earth, especially in the last 6 millennia. But where did he come from? What was his ultimate goal? From his arrival in the world to his final downfall, what path did he walk? This is the full story of Sauron, from beginning to end.
Hello everyone and welcome to Middle-earth Tales. I am Murat. For over 7 years, I have been a dedicated Middle-earth creator on my primary Turkish channel. English is not my native language and I have strong accent, but I am deeply in love with Tolkien Legendarium. To reach the world, I am letting an AI clone of my own voice handle the speaking from here on, mostly for the sake of your ears. But please remember, every script written and edited by me, not by AI. Let's go.
Long before he was ever called Sauron, the spirit that would one day become Middle-earth's greatest tyrant came into existence in the timeless halls, brought into being by Eru Ilúvatar, just like many other mighty and lesser spirits. He was among those who took part in the great music, the divine symphony that shaped Arda before it even came into being. Yet, though he was powerful, his might did not compare to that of the Valar, the most potent among Eru's creations. Unlike Ulmo, who envisioned the seas and rivers, or Aule, who shaped the earth, Sauron's influence in the great music was not defining. However, there is no indication that this disparity in power ever troubled him or shaped his character. Sauron never questioned the measure of strength granted to him. When Arda was finally given form by Eru and transformed from mere vision into reality, Sauron was among those who descended into the world. Though he was not one of the 15 mighty Valar, he was one of the countless spirits known as the Maia, beings of great power, yet lesser than the Valar. Even so, Sauron stood among the strongest of his kind, possibly equal in might to Eönwë, the herald of Manwë. But, as we see time and again in Middle-earth's history, power is not always as straightforward as it seems. In the end, Sauron's dominion would be undone not by those greater than him, but by those seemingly far beneath him. But that part of the tale lies at the very end. For now, let us return to the very beginning when the Valar and Maiar descended into the world to shape it, preparing Arda for the elves and men whose arrival had been foretold by Eru Ilúvatar himself, because this is when Sauron's story begins. In those early days, he was not yet known as Sauron. His name was Mairon, meaning the Admirable. While we do not have exact records of his deeds during the time known as the Spring of Arda, before Melkor's dark shadow fell upon the world, there are reasons to believe that Mairon lived up to his name. At that time, he was one of the many Maiar who served Aule the Smith, the great Vala who shaped the mountains, plains, and very earth of Arda. It is likely that Mairon, under Aule's guidance, played a role in shaping the physical world, using his vast skill in craftsmanship and order. We know very little about Sauron's physical appearance during this age, as no records were kept from those ancient days. However, thousands of years later, during the Second Age of the Sun, when he took on a fair form, even the Númenóreans were awestruck by his majesty. Upon that ship which was cast the highest and stood dry upon a hill, there was a man, or one in man's shape, but greater than any even of the race of Númenor in stature. And it seemed to men that Sauron was great, though they feared the light of his eyes. To many he appeared fair, to others terrible, but to some evil. From this we can infer that before he fell into Melkor's service, Sauron's form may have been similarly striking, both imposing and awe-inspiring. However, we must also remember that this is a perspective shaped by men, who often saw power and majesty in different ways than the elves. While we may not have a precise description of Sauron's physical appearance, there is enough information to understand his character. Sauron was obsessed with order and perfection. To him, everything had to exist within a strict natural order, and only through this could true perfection be achieved. Given this mindset, it makes perfect sense that he served Aule the smith, for Aule was the Vala who sought to bring structure and harmony to the very earth itself, an ideal that aligned with Sauron's own inclinations. But, at some point, this obsession with order led Sauron away from the ways of the Valar. Bringing order to the world was one thing, but leaving its fate in the hands of elves and men, that was something Sauron could not accept. How could these lesser beings, far weaker than the mighty Valar and Maiar, possibly maintain order and ensure its perfection? Even with all his power, Sauron could not comprehend why the Valar would simply step aside and entrust their creation to such fragile creatures. This frustration ultimately drove him away from the Valar's rule and into the service of Melkor, the only one willing to use his full power to shape the world as he saw fit. For Sauron, it did not matter whether the order was built upon good or evil foundations, only that it was absolute. As long as it functioned flawlessly, morality was irrelevant. Thus, he did not concern himself with Melkor's destruction, as long as it led to a structured, controlled world. And so, Sauron chose to become evil, not out of malice or cruelty, but because he believed it was the only logical path to true order. I want to make another video discussing Sauron's obsession with order, whether he was originally good, and whether choosing Melkor's side truly made him evil. So for now, let's set this debate aside and move forward. There is no definitive information on exactly when Sauron abandoned the Valar and joined Melkor. It must have happened sometime between Melkor's destruction of the Great Lamps and his eventual capture in Utumno. Some sources suggest that Sauron was already acting as Melkor's spy while the Valar still lived on Almarin, before the lamps were destroyed. What we do know for certain is that by the time the Valar destroyed Utumno, Sauron was fully under Melkor's command and had taken charge of Angband. But did Sauron originally travel with the Valar to Aman after the destruction of the lamps, only to later defect? There is no solid evidence suggesting that he ever saw the two trees. This leads me to believe that when the Valar abandoned Almarin and set sail for Aman, Sauron chose to remain behind and sided with Melkor instead. If this is true, then he never stepped foot in Valinor and never beheld the light of the trees. It would also disprove the idea that he was a long-term spy among the Valar, as Melkor would have certainly wanted his agent to continue feeding him intelligence until the last possible moment. Regardless of how it happened, the Valar did not seem particularly concerned about Sauron's betrayal. They did not view his defection as a significant loss, nor did they believe it would shift the balance of power. This was a grave mistake, one they made not once, but twice. The first instance was during the War of the Powers, when they focused their full strength on Utumno, but did not give the same level of attention to Angband and Sauron. They neither captured him nor completely destroyed Angband, likely because they did not consider him a major threat in the absence of his master. But they were wrong. While Melkor remained imprisoned in Valinor, Sauron was not idle. He spent those long years restoring the ruins of Angband, expanding its strongholds, and increasing the numbers of his orc armies. When Melkor finally returned after destroying the two trees, he was welcomed not by desolation, but by a fully prepared army ready to serve him. For much of the First Age, Sauron's activities remain unclear. In the first half of the age, Angband was under siege by the Noldor, who had sworn an oath to avenge Finwë's death and reclaim the Silmarils. What happened behind Angband's iron gates during this period is largely unknown. While Melkor was preoccupied with crafting dragons and engaging in other grand designs, it's reasonable to assume that his most trusted lieutenant, Sauron, was responsible for maintaining order within Angband. After all, order and control were his specialties. However, this does not mean that Sauron was merely a passive administrator. Once the siege was broken in the Battle of Sudden Flame, he stepped onto the battlefield in person, taking a more active role in Melkor's war against the Eldar. But before diving into Sauron's actions in Beleriand, I want to highlight an interesting detail, one that further illustrates his obsession with order. Sauron, unlike almost everyone else, never showed any fascination with the Silmarils. These were gems so mesmerizing that even the Valar themselves were enchanted by their beauty. Melkor, despite being burned by them, could not resist wearing them. The Silmarils had driven entire elven kingdoms to destruction, yet Sauron seemed entirely indifferent to them. Had he ever gained possession of them, he would have likely worn them as a symbol of his supreme rule. But to him, they were nothing more than beautiful jewels. They served no real function in his grand vision of perfect order. This is why Sauron and the Silmarils were never directly associated with one another in any meaningful way. After the Battle of Sudden Flame, as Melkor pushed southward, Sauron's name began to appear more frequently in the annals of history. Speaking of names, it was during this period that he was given the name Sauron by the elves. While Mairen meant the admirable, Sauron carried the exact opposite meaning, the abhorred. It's unlikely that he ever willingly adopted this name himself, but regardless of what he was called, his rise had begun. Under Melkor's command, he led an army to attack the Syrian Valley. Their target was a fortress called Minas Tirith, not to be confused with its more famous namesake in the Third Age. Just like its later counterpart, this Minas Tirith meant Tower of Watch, and its name was well earned. Positioned atop an island in the middle of the Syrian River, the fortress had a commanding view of the valley, allowing it to monitor any movement between the north and the south. It was a crucial stronghold blocking the way between Angband and the lands further south. Sauron and his army overran it with relative ease. After its capture, the island became a den of monstrous wolves, huge and intelligent enough to be called werewolves, and massive bat-like creatures known as vampires. Melkor's decision to send his most trusted lieutenant to occupy this location was no coincidence. Sauron possessed an exceptional awareness, an almost supernatural ability to perceive everything around him. It was said that he could stand atop the tower at the heart of the island and see everything that moved in the valley below. No elf, no orc, nothing could pass unnoticed beneath his watchful gaze. This is the very foundation of the symbol Sauron would adopt in the Third Age, the lidless eye, endlessly watching all that unfolds. Sauron knows and sees everything. Of course, history would eventually prove that even he could be blind to certain things, but we haven't reached that part of the story just yet. During this time, Sauron was tasked by Melkor with hunting down and eliminating Barahir and his men, who were waging a desperate guerrilla war in the region. Orc scouts had noticed that one of Barahir's men, Gorlim, frequently returned to the ruins of his old home. Sauron devised a cruel trap to extract information from him. One evening, as Gorlim approached his ruined home, he was shown a vision. His wife was waiting inside. Overcome with emotion and confusion, Gorlim was then captured by Sauron. Sauron told him that if he revealed Barahir's hiding place, he would be reunited with his beloved wife. But it was all a deception. Gorlim's wife had been dead for some time, and the vision he saw was nothing more than an illusion conjured by Sauron. Desperate and deceived, Gorlim revealed the location of Barahir's refuge. Once Sauron had what he needed, he had Gorlim executed. The key takeaway from this incident is not just Gorlim's betrayal, but rather Sauron's ability to create illusions. This moment gives us a rare glimpse into his mastery of deception, revealing a power that allowed him to craft false realities capable of tricking even the sharpest minds. However, many questions about this ability remain unanswered. Could it affect multiple people at once? How long could such illusions be sustained? Could they influence only the weak-willed, or even those of great willpower? Unfortunately, historical records do not mention Sauron using this ability so explicitly ever again. The death of Barahir triggered Beren and Lúthien's quest for the Silmaril. During this mission, Beren, disguised as an orc alongside Finrod, attempted to pass through the watchful gaze of Minas Tirith on his way north to Angband. Sauron detected them. He captured the pair and threw them into his dungeon, where Finrod met his end. Following this, Lúthien set out to find Beren, accompanied by Huan, the hunting hound of the Vala Orme. Thanks to a spell of concealment, she was able to reach the island unnoticed. However, once they arrived at the fortress, they were discovered. Recognizing Lúthien as the daughter of the Maia Melian, Sauron sought to capture her and offer her as a gift to Melkor. He unleashed his werewolves upon them, but Huan slew each one that came at them. Realizing that he was facing none other than the legendary Huan, Sauron recalled the prophecy that foretold the hound's fate. He would only fall in battle against the greatest wolf to ever exist. Seizing upon this, Sauron took the form of a massive wolf, unaware that the wolf spoken of in the prophecy was, at that very moment, still dozing at Angband's gates. Even so, Sauron nearly overcame Huan, but Lúthien cast a spell that left him dazed. Seizing the moment, Huan clamped his mighty jaws onto Sauron's throat. Desperate, Sauron shifted into the form of a serpent, but when he realized escape was impossible, he finally took the shape of a bat and fled. Just like his power of illusion, there is no record of Sauron ever using his shape-shifting abilities again. It was as if his ability to change form had been entirely depleted in this confrontation. After this event, Sauron's name fades from record for a long time. He is not mentioned in any of the major events of the First Age, nor even in pivotal battles such as the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. His name only resurfaces at the end of the First Age, during the War of Wrath, when Melkor faced his ultimate and final defeat. After the war, Eönwë, the commander of the armies of Valinor, ordered Sauron to surrender himself and submit to judgment, accepting whatever punishment would be decreed. However, fearing the wrath of the Valar, Sauron chose to flee instead. Here, we see for the second time how Valinor failed to treat Sauron with the importance he deserved. Rather than ensuring his capture, binding him in chains if necessary, they were lax enough to let him escape. The first mistake had allowed Melkor, upon his return to Middle-earth, to find Angband still functioning and an entire army of orcs ready to serve him, all thanks to Sauron. But this second mistake would go on to shape the next 2 ages, influencing the course of history for a total of 6,000 years. It is important to remember that by the beginning of the Second Age, very few among the inhabitants of Middle-earth had actually witnessed the events at the end of the First Age. The army that defeated Melkor had come from Valinor, and among them were only a handful of elves who had lived in Beleriand. In fact, by the time the war ended, these elves likely did not even know what had been said to Sauron, nor whether he had escaped or perished. Moreover, aside from his time in Minas Tirith, Sauron had not caused as much direct devastation as figures like the dragon Glorung or the Balrog Gothmog. Even if they had known he had escaped, they might have made the same mistake as the Valar, underestimating him. Believing that they were finally free from calamities, both elves and men spent the first 1,500 years of the Second Age in relative peace and prosperity. Meanwhile, in another corner of the world, Númenor, the island granted to the men who had fought against Melkor, was flourishing, growing in wealth and power. Sauron waited. He watched and remained hidden for a full 1,000 years. At last he became convinced that the Valar no longer concerned themselves with Middle-earth, and that the time had come to establish his own dominion, his vision of perfect order. The Valar still cared about Middle-earth, but they did not see Sauron as a threat. After all, they had not even bothered to search for him. Whatever their reasoning, Sauron knew that his time had come. He made his way to the land that would later be called Mordor, and to begin his work, gathered the scattered orc tribes to construct his great stronghold, Barad-dûr. But there was a problem. His experiences in the First Age had taught him one undeniable truth. Elves would never submit to him. Dwarves could be swayed with treasure, and most men would eventually align themselves with power, but elves would never willingly become part of his envisioned order. Even Melkor had failed to destroy them by force, so war was a last resort, something to be used only when all other means had failed. Sauron needed another way to control the elves. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. Among the elves, who generally had little interest in soil, metal, or smithing, there was a particular group that displayed an unusual fascination with these very things. More than that, they even collaborated with the dwarves, a people with whom elves had long struggled to maintain harmony. And so, a plan began to take shape. To ensure that the elves would not recognize him, Sauron once again changed his form, taking on a fair and noble appearance. But one must wonder, had this transformation cost him something? Had adopting this radiant form, which was now so contrary to his nature, required him to expend the last remnants of his shape-shifting power? Is that why we never again see him take the form of a great wolf or serpent? After all, we know that Melkor, too, had diminished himself by pouring his power into shaping the world, gradually exhausting his strength. It seems that, whether Maia or even Vala, power is not something that replenishes over time, once spent. It is lost forever. For now, I'll leave this question here. Perhaps in a future video we'll delve deeper into this mystery. Disguised in a fair form, Sauron arrived in Eregion in the year 1500 of the Second Age, the land of the Smith Elves. Introducing himself as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, he claimed to be an emissary of the Valinor. The elven smiths, believing they could benefit from the knowledge of a representative of the Valinor, welcomed him into their ranks. However, Sauron did not receive such a warm reception in other elven realms. High King Gil-galad of the Noldor, as well as Elrond and Galadriel, regarded him with suspicion. He was neither invited nor welcomed in Lindon. Warnings were sent to elven smiths, urging them not to trust the one who called himself Annatar. But clearly the promises Sauron made had captivated them. Thus, under his guidance, they began crafting enchanted rings. Within a century, under the leadership of Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor, the Smith Elves and Annatar forged many magical rings. Some were failures, some were weak, but 16 of them were deemed successful. Sauron's plan was simple yet insidious. Those who wore these 16 rings, crafted with his direct involvement, would fall under the influence of the one ring he would create. Through it, He would peer into their minds, learn their plans, and even implant thoughts into them, making them believe they were their own. To dominate the wearers of these rings, the One Ring had to be unrivaled in power, and only Sauron himself possessed such strength. In the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, he forged the One Ring, pouring a vast portion of his own power into it. His overconfidence in himself and his might was so absolute that he never once considered the possibility that anything could go wrong. This led him to take an extremely risky step, binding his very essence to a single object. But things went wrong from the very beginning. There were 3 other rings of power that Sauron had no knowledge of. Celebrimbor had forged these 3 rings in secret, keeping their existence hidden from him. Since Sauron had never touched them, he had not corrupted them directly, yet they were still crafted using the knowledge he had imparted. This meant they were not entirely free from his influence. The moment Sauron put on the One Ring, he became aware of the existence of these 3 rings. But so did the elves, realizing his treachery. His plan cut short before it could even begin. Sauron made no move for the next 90 years. His desire to control the elves without force had failed, leaving him with only one option: war. During this time, Celebrimbor, either out of wisdom or fear of Sauron's wrath, decided to entrust the 3 rings to others for safekeeping. He gave one to Galadriel and the other 2 to Gil-galad. Eventually, Sauron openly claimed dominion over the rings and demanded they be surrendered to him. When the elves refused, he waged war upon them. By then, nearly 2 centuries had passed since he had first revealed himself, and it had been 700 years since the construction of Barad-dûr had begun. The year was now 1700 of the Second Age. He struck swiftly and mercilessly. The Smith elves were slaughtered, and Sauron seized the 16 rings. Later, he would distribute 7 of them to the dwarves and 9 to men. However, he could not find the 3 rings that had been forged in secret. Even after personally torturing Celebrimbor, he failed to learn their whereabouts. Enraged, he killed Celebrimbor and displayed his body on a spear. Sauron had viewed the elves as an obstacle to the order he wished to establish, and now that his plan to control them through the rings had failed, he resolved to destroy them instead. His greatest target was Lindon, where High King Gil-galad ruled. If Lindon fell, the remaining elven realms would soon follow. Thus, Sauron launched a large-scale invasion. However, the force that would ultimately stop this invasion was one he had initially dismissed as insignificant, and in some ways, he was justified in doing so. But just as the Valar had underestimated Sauron, so too did Sauron miscalculate where the real threat lay: men. While all of this was unfolding, the men of Númenor had grown in power and influence. Having long outgrown their island, they had already begun establishing colonies in Middle-earth. When Gil-galad sent a plea for aid, Númenor answered. In the Battle of Gwathlo, Sauron was overwhelmed by the combined forces of Númenor and the elves. Defeated in disgrace, he was forced to retreat all the way back to Mordor. Sauron had believed he could not subdue the elves by force, and for a time, he had nearly succeeded. But just as the Valar had failed to recognize Sauron as a true threat, he had now been struck down from an unexpected direction by men. Yet men were still men, and by their very nature, they were highly susceptible to manipulation. After his defeat, Sauron fled back to Mordor, and strangely, no one pursued him. Perhaps they believed he had learned his lesson, or maybe this time it was Númenor's turn to underestimate him. Whatever the reason, 5 centuries passed. Sauron recovered from his defeat, and though he never left Mordor again, he became a significant power once more. He even began calling himself the King of Kings, a title he made sure would reach the ears of Numenor's king. And indeed, it did. Ar-Pharazôn, the king of Numenor at the height of its power, was outraged by the arrogance of this so-called ruler. He decided Sauron needed to be taught a lesson. A fleet larger than any seen before set sail from Numenor, heading toward the port of Umbar in Middle-earth. It is said that when the fleet arrived, an observer looking from Umbar toward the sea could see nothing but ships, so vast was their number. Sauron, who had long been watching the might of Numenor and had already suffered an unforgettable defeat at their hands, had no intention of repeating his mistakes. If there had been any lingering doubt in his mind that brute force alone was not enough to conquer his enemies, this spectacle erased it. Once again, Sauron set aside war and turned to deception. He surrendered to Numenor willingly. Whether the saying, "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer," existed in Middle-earth is unknown, but Sauron certainly understood the concept well. At this point, we need to take a moment to examine Numenor. It is doubtful whether the men of Numenor, and even Ar-Pharazôn himself, truly understood the nature of Sauron. The Numenorians had never seen a living, breathing Vala, let alone a Maia. For thousands of years during the Second Age, the beings said to dwell in the forbidden lands of Valinor had played no role in their lives or history. The events of the First Age were nothing more than ancient legends to them. As a result, they had no real understanding of the dangerous entity they had so casually welcomed into their midst. At that time, Numenor was far more powerful than it had been when Sauron had last faced them. Ar-Pharazôn saw himself as the Lord of the world, and in truth, he was. From their perspective, there was no reason to fear Sauron. Sauron, playing the role of a humbled prisoner, acted as if he were overwhelmed by Numenor's might, claiming his only wish was to serve this great civilization. Yet, the moment he set foot on the island, he likely saw what he had already suspected, the corruption and division within the realm. The people of Numenor were split. Their rulers had not only abandoned the values that once made them great, but they had sworn to destroy them. The kingdom, already teetering on the edge of a precipice, needed only a slight push, and Sauron gave it. He whispered words into the king's ear, words Ar-Pharazôn wanted to hear. As Sauron's influence grew, those hungry for power flocked to his side, and the more they gathered, the stronger his presence became. When Sauron was taken to Numenor as a captive, the year was 3261 of the Second Age, but in just a single year, by 3262, temples dedicated to Melkor had been erected, and men were being sacrificed in his name. When the Númenóreans built temples in Melkor's name and began sacrificing men, the Valar saw that they had strayed too far. As a warning, they sent storms and great eagles over the island, an unmistakable message. "We see you. Do not lose your way." During one of these lightning-filled tempests, Sauron climbed to the top of the temple's dome and openly defied the storm. At that moment, a bolt of lightning struck the temple, partially collapsing it. But as the Númenóreans watched in horror, they saw Sauron standing amidst the destruction, laughing, unscathed. After this event, many came to believe he was a god. His plan to bring Numenor to ruin took 50 years to unfold. Nearly half a century after his supposed imprisonment, in the year 3319 of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn launched an even greater fleet and set sail for Valinor. the consequences were catastrophic. Eru Ilúvatar himself intervened, and the great island of Númenor was swallowed by the sea, along with nearly all its people. Only a small number of men who had remained faithful to the Valar survived the destruction. One who did not escape was Sauron. His physical body was lost beneath the waves, but that was a sacrifice he had been willing to make for such a grand victory. His dark spirit fled like a shadow upon the wind, returning to Mordor. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Sauron had the One Ring with him during his time in Númenor. The exact length of time it took for Sauron's spirit to manifest a new body after returning to Mordor remains unknown. However, since the One Ring, containing a significant portion of his power, was still in his possession, it likely didn't take long. But there was one irreversible truth. Whether a being was a Vala or a Maia, power in Middle-earth did not replenish over time. Once spent, it was gone forever, whether locked within a physical form or bound to an artifact like a ring. And now, with his essence completely consumed by darkness, Sauron could no longer assume a fair form. At this point, it seems reasonable to conclude that his ability to shapeshift had been lost entirely. After returning to Mordor, Sauron did not sit idle for the next 120 years, until the year 3441, when he faced the combined forces of Gondor, Arnor, and the Elves. During this time, if any of the rings of power remained undistributed before his departure to Númenor, he may have finally given them out. The timeline of Sauron's distribution of the rings is unclear. We know he had given out some before Númenor's fall, but by this period he had certainly observed their effects. He must have realized that the rings of power did not have the desired effect on the dwarves. In contrast, they worked beyond his expectations on men, an outcome that surely pleased him. Now, we have reached the end of the Second Age. In the year 3441, after a grueling 7-year siege of Barad-dûr, the forces of the last alliance of elves and men, led by key figures such as Gil-galad, Elrond, and Círdan among the elves, and Elendil, Isildur, and Anarion among men, faced off against Sauron's armies. The war ended with devastating losses on both sides, including the deaths of Gil-galad and Elendil. But most importantly, it resulted in Sauron losing his physical form once again. For the first time since he forged it, the One Ring was taken from him and fell into the hands of another. This battle was an even greater disaster for Sauron than the defeat he suffered at Gwathlo, perhaps the most catastrophic loss he had ever endured. The Third Age was a time when Sauron himself remained unseen, spending much of the era regaining his strength, while waging his battles through his servants, allies, and most notably, the Nazgûl, over whom he now had complete control. For the first 1,000 years of the Third Age, just as in the early centuries of the Second Age, there was peace and relative stability. However, in the year 1000, Sauron resurfaced in secret at a stronghold that would later be known as Dol Guldur, deep within what would come to be called Mirkwood. Middle-earth remained unaware of his return, but Valinor was not so easily deceived. They knew that Sauron had not been truly vanquished, and that sooner or later he would rise again to trouble the world. They sent 5 Maia, known as the Astari, to aid the Free Peoples in their inevitable struggle against Sauron. Though this plan itself nearly ended in disaster, that is a story for another time. 3 centuries after his secret return, in the year 1300, the Nazgûl began to re-emerge. The orcs beneath the mountains stirred once more, and Sauron's long-standing allies, the Easterlings, became a growing threat. All of these forces had one common purpose: to weaken and ultimately destroy the Númenórean-founded kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. Having paid dearly in the Second Age for underestimating men, Sauron now regarded them as his primary enemies. And he was right to do so, for the elves were gradually leaving Middle-earth, fading into the west, and were no longer the dominant power they had once been. The centuries passed slowly, like winds carving away at stone, gradually wearing down both Arnor and Gondor. In the year 2061, concerned by Dol Gúldur's growing influence, Gandalf suspected that Sauron might have returned and decided to investigate the Forsaken stronghold. However, Sauron was not yet ready to reveal himself or face Gandalf directly. Instead, he withdrew to the east, forcing Gandalf to leave without any definitive answers. This incident must have deeply unsettled Sauron, for he completely concealed himself, ordering his servants to halt all activities and retreat. This period, known as the Watchful Peace, a time when everyone remained on edge, expecting something to happen at any moment, lasted for 400 years. It finally ended in 2460, when Sauron, once again in secret, returned to Dol Guldur. Under his command, his servants resumed their attacks, gradually escalating their efforts. Where Sauron spent those 400 years remains unknown, but since he is said to have traveled east, it is likely that he sought refuge among his longtime allies, the Easterlings. As events neared their final stages, Arnor had already fallen, largely due to the relentless efforts of the Witch King, and Gondor had lost its royal bloodline. The constant attacks from the Easterlings and the forces of Umbar had left Gondor weaker than ever before. Sauron's plan was unfolding perfectly. There was only one problem. The One Ring, which held much of his power, was still beyond his grasp. But it seems that even the ring itself sensed that the time had come, for in the very year Sauron returned to Dol Guldur, 2460, it was found once again. Was it mere coincidence that the power within the One Ring stirred at that exact moment? Certainly not. This proves that exactly 2460 years after he lost his body, Sauron has finally returned with all the power possible at that moment, and has probably completed the process of gaining a physical form. The previous time he had lost his body, the process had taken mere decades, but this time it had required over 2 millennia, plus an additional 460 years. The primary reason for this was, of course, his separation from the ring, where most of his power was stored. Whatever strength remained in him, he had used it sparingly, or perhaps he had still been able to draw upon the ring's power, but as if through a barrier, like trying to reach something locked behind solid iron. Maybe that's why it took 24 centuries to gain enough power. We must remember that the power of the great beings of Middle-earth did not replenish over time. If we consider the energy Sauron had to expend just to become active again, it becomes clear that by the time he emerged as a threat once more, he possessed only a fraction of his former might. Yet even that fraction was enough to threaten a world where the elves were dwindling and men had grown weak. Now imagine if he had reclaimed the One Ring. No force in the Third Age would have been able to stop him. Sauron's plan was proceeding flawlessly, except for the crucial fact that the ring was not yet in his possession. 4 centuries later, in the year 2850, Gandalf once again ventured into Dol Guldur. This time, he confirmed beyond doubt that the dark power residing there was indeed Sauron. The White Council was convened, but due to the treachery of Saruman, who would later be revealed as a traitor, the decision was made to wait. This deception cost them another 100 years. Finally, in 2941, when the White Council moved against Dol Guldur, Sauron abandoned it just before their arrival, returning to Mordor. That same year, indeed, almost at the exact same time, the One Ring stirred once more. After 400 years in Gollum's possession, it finally abandoned him, ensuring that it would be found again. And so, by sheer fate or design, the hobbit Bilbo stumbled upon the ring in the depths of the Misty Mountains. Now, it was only a matter of time before Sauron found it. And all of this brings us to the War of the Ring and the moment Sauron ceased to exist. Several times, his servants came dangerously close to reclaiming the One Ring, yet each time it slipped just beyond their grasp. Sauron knew the ring was in the hands of an insignificant race, a hobbit, and so he dismissed them entirely. Surely his enemies would never entrust such a powerful artifact to such a lowly creature. Either Elrond, Galadriel, the newly revealed heir of Isildur, Aragorn, or at worst, Gandalf would seize it and wield it against him. To Sauron, there was no other possibility. A being obsessed with power and order, he could not even conceive of the idea that such an artifact would not be used. But in the end, what had happened many times before in this tale happened once more. The one who was overlooked, dismissed as unimportant, changed the course of history, while Sauron focused all his attention on his enemies, waiting to see which of them would claim the ring. The small creature he had ignored, a hobbit, slipped right under his nose and caused the ring to be destroyed. And with it, though the ring was no longer in his grasp, the power that had kept his existence intact was undone. Without that strength, his remaining essence could no longer hold itself together. Like black smoke scattering in the wind, he dissolved, never to return, never again possessing even the strength to stir a single leaf. And that is the story of Sauron, one of the most important figures who shaped the history of Middle-earth. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope the strange pronunciations of some names did not bother you too much. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like. Until we meet again next time, take care.